We, two psychologists with over 40 years of combined experience, share our insights to help undercomplicate important topics. A friendly reminder as we get started is that this video is for entertainment purposes only. So please see the information section of this video for additional resources.
I'm a health psychologist and a presenter and have my own healthcare consulting and professional coaching business.
So I also am a psychologist, a coach. I work with professional women to help them recognize how they're more than enough. And I also do speaking and writing. So I co-authored a book called You Will Get Through This with two other amazing mental health clinicians. And Stacey, we actually just recently hit the 1 year anniversary, which feels surreal. So you
Wow.
can find links in the description if you wanted to learn more about us. Our topic today, our question is, what is grief?
I think an overriding descriptor could be, thoughts, feelings, behaviors that are occurring because of a loss.
Mm,
Um, and a lot of people understand grief in terms of, or loss in terms of a loved one. Um, but there's a lot of other things that we can grieve throughout our lives. And
mm.
I know it comes up for me a lot with my coaching. And I'm wondering if you've experienced also clients or people coming to you with help for grief.
Grief is, there's a definition that we can build understanding on. It also looks really different depending on who it is that's grieving and, as you mentioned, what you're grieving. And so I have worked with many individuals who are going through different transitions in life. They might be retiring. They might have left a job and be starting a new role. They might have realized that they lost connection with a friend that they really felt was somebody important in their life. And so many times I try to make space for and have this conversation with people around that sounds like grief. That sounds like a significant loss in your life that you might be grieving over. And oftentimes what I hear, and I'm curious if this comes up when you're working with people too, is people are like, well, no, you grieve for, your grandma passed, or, maybe a loved like pet from the family. But otherwise, like the idea of experiencing grief for life changes or expectations that you had about your life that just don't look the way you thought they would, that's sort of this radical idea that grief can show up in so many ways.
And when you ask people if they could describe how they thought, felt, behaved when, let's say, a loved one or someone important to them died, and then you ask them, well, how do you feel? And we'll just take maybe a job loss. How do you
Mm.
feel about that? Do you feel sad? Is there some anger and frustration and disbelief and all of those things? And I think what I've noticed in my clients is there's this push and rush to kind of get through and go on to the next thing. So again, just taking job loss as an example, where instead of allowing themselves time and space to feel those feelings and acknowledge them, and we know they come in waves. It's not just a stage where you go through grief and then you're done.
Mm.
It comes up at different times that can affect us, and really educating people and giving them that space to feel and think and really process that loss.
The frameworks that we often hear about when we talk about grief, and people might then be like, well, I can't be experiencing grief. I'm not in denial. I'm not angry. I'm not accepting, and then also difficulty sometimes that we have giving ourselves permission to process and whatever that looks like, and how much time and space. And, some people need to listen to music and just give themselves time to feel all their feelings. Some people need to journal about it. Some people need to talk to other people about it. And you could fill in the blank with a million other things, like genuinely a million other things. And so I'm curious, what are the like? What would you encourage somebody to do if they felt like they needed to grieve a certain way, or needed to, like, they, weren't doing something right in their grief?
Yeah, I think I would start those are all excellent points. And I think I would start with asking them, what do you think you're doing wrong? Uh,
Mm,
and people have said before, well, I'm not, like you said, crying enough. I'm not angry enough.
mm,
I'm not this enough. And really letting people know that everybody grieves differently. There are no two people. I mean, if you could even try to have the same sort of loss, and we know that's never exactly the same,
mhm,
one person to the next will grieve differently, and there's not a right way or a wrong way. The only thing that can be complicated is if you delay the grief or avoid it or try to go around it or leapfrog over it. You know,
mm,
it is one of those things that we have to go through to really get on the other side. And so that can actually prevent um, kind of proper healing and proper grieving if people are avoidant or they just don't recognize, like you said earlier, that it actually is grief. And
mm,
I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've had some clients where all of a sudden there's this, you're right, that's it. That's
mm,
why I'm stuck.
mm.
That's why it's hard for me to move forward with what I want to do because I haven't really grieved all of those losses and changes. Um, what are some things that you've faced with your clients?
Yeah, I um I 100% resonate with what you're saying. In the Some of the things that I've heard are pushing down or pushing away the grief of, if I don't recognize it, if I don't make space for it, then it'll just go away. Like, it's not grief, so you might minimize it, or you might say, even if it is grief, like, I'm strong enough to not need to fall apart. I'm tough and I got this. And one of the things that often happens is we can get struck by grief if we're not coping with it, or even if we are trying to like address and cope with it, we can get struck by grief at any time for different, activating events that we might
Mhm.
not even be aware of. You might be walking down the grocery aisle and you see a bag of cookies that maybe those are the cookies you ate with your grandma who passed away a year ago, and you just start crying and you're like, what's happening?
Where'd that
That's
come
grief,
from?
right? Yeah, so I find that what I hear most often is people not even recognizing that it is grief, that we grieve for so many things in our lives. Like, we grieve for what we thought our lives would look like when we were little kids to what they are now. And we can be really thankful and find gratitude in the things that we have. But we also, it's fair to make space and can feel grief on, oh, I thought this would happen for me. And I thought that would happen for my loved ones. And I didn't think I would have to make that choice, whatever it is. Making space that, like, for this idea and this fact that grief is just throughout our lives, and to make space for it so that you're not pushing it down and it doesn't then bubble up and bubble over when you least expect it. What do you say to yourself? What do you do if you start crying in the cookie aisle
Mhm.
in the supermarket? Like, do you want to be kind to yourself and be compassionate? Or do you want to try to be mad at yourself and shame yourself and push that down? Like, how you treat yourself in those moments, those grief moments, is really important.
I 100% agree with that. And to your point about kind of suddenly experiencing a realization or a reminder of grief. It almost, to me, the analogy I come up with is that you're walking along a beach, the water's fine, all of a sudden you just get hit by this big wave, didn't expect
Mm,
it. You know, a lot of times people might anticipate anniversary reactions or dates or things like that. But other things hit them out of the blue and can be a little unsettling. And so
mm,
normalizing that, I think, is really helpful. And then you mentioned another really important aspect of grief. And what comes to mind for me is, let's say, of loss, someone's ended a relationship. And they'll talk about how things were and how things used to be you know, when they were younger, when they started families. And you're right that a lot of people don't think about you're also grieving what you thought you would be doing with this person in
mm,
5 years, 10 years, you know, further on in your life. And again, I think that's a big part of grief that gets missed as well, as you mentioned, the here's what we thought our life was going to be like and what we are going to do. And again, applying that to any sort of loss, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so as we start to wrap up on this topic, knowing that we could talk about this for
Yes.
hours, and what might you want people who are listening, who are either aware and going, yes, this is so validating because I know I feel grief for all these different things in my life, or people who are just dipping their toes in this idea of, oh, I can feel grief for other things. Like what would you want people to walk away with from our conversation?
I think one of my most favorite quotes, and a colleague used to have it on a sign in her office, is
Mm.
grief is the solution, not the problem. Uh,
Mm.
which is why grief isn't a mental health disorder. This is a normal thing. So that's one thing that I try to help people with, that this is the solution. Um, and for you, do you have some takeaways that you find particularly helpful?
Yeah. Um, so we can feel grief for many things in our lives, not just the loss of a loved one. Helping people recognize that grief is something that you probably feel more than you realize.
True.
That is one of the key takeaways. Another is what we talked about, allowing yourself space
Yeah,
to grieve. That just like you're saying, grief is the solution. It's not the problem. It is your body, your heart, your mind, like your emotions are sending you a signal that they need you to make space and to support yourself. And so letting yourself do that, allow yourself to feel your feelings about grief and to not go into some sort of shame spiral or to push it down or push it away. So I have to say, I love this conversation. I'm excited for our future conversations. And so if any of you listening have questions that have come up related to topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, please feel free to comment on this video or to send us messages on our social media. And we will see you in our next video.
yeah. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you. Bye, all.